They never planned for you to stay in their mind this long. But the real shock is not that they think about you, it's that they can't seem to stop, even when they try to. Welcome to Jungian Path, where we explore the hidden layers of the human mind, uncovering the psychological forces behind attraction, emotion, and the silent battles people fight within themselves. They didn't wake up planning to have you on their mind. That part is important to understand. No one consciously chooses that kind of mental pull. Most people are not built to sit with what they actually feel, so they push it down instead, hoping it disappears. But emotions don't work like that. What hits with intensity usually wins over what's ignored. Silence and indifference don't announce themselves, they just settle in quietly. But what they're dealing with isn't quiet at all. It's been building underneath everything they try to hold together, like something unfolding behind closed eyes that they can't fully control anymore. You probably sensed it too, that subtle change in the energy between you and them. Something that didn't feel like distance or confusion, but something more unsettling, recognition, a kind of internal awareness that something about you stayed with them longer than it should have. But people rarely accept feelings when they first appear. They resist them, they rationalize them, they push them down under pride, logic, distraction, and carefully built emotional walls, especially when what they feel doesn't fit the identity they're trying to maintain. And that's where the tension begins, because the more a feeling threatens someone's ego or sense of control, the more aggressively it gets buried. Psychology has long described this as repression, where the mind pushes away anything it considers too emotionally disruptive. But repression doesn't remove anything, it only compresses it. And what gets compressed always creates pressure. Most people never notice this part. What they refuse to acknowledge doesn't vanish, it slowly starts influencing them instead. Something they dismissed yesterday can quietly start shaping their reactions today. That's why this moment feels different for them. Not because something new started, but because something internal finally gave way. And you weren't there to witness it happen. What they experienced wasn't a confession or a message. It was a private breakdown of denial, a moment where usual distractions didn't work anymore, where their mental escape routes stopped functioning, and where silence became too loud to ignore. And in that silence, your presence showed up again, not as a simple memory, but as something more confronting, something that forced attention. Attraction alone is easy to dismiss. Curiosity fades, but emotional significance is different. That's when the mind starts struggling, because it has to ask a question it keeps avoiding. Why does this person affect me like this? So they tried to explain it away. They told themselves it was temporary, nothing serious, just coincidence, timing, chemistry, circumstances, anything except what it actually was. But here's what they keep running into. You don't spend mental energy fighting something that has no meaning. You don't try to suppress something that feels irrelevant. And you definitely don't keep returning to something that supposedly doesn't matter. Every attempt to push you away only made the thought of you clearer. Every effort to detach only deepened the pull. Every distraction eventually collapsed at the exact moment they needed it most. That isn't randomness. That's resistance meeting something it can't fully override. They wanted control. That was always the goal. But something about this situation didn't stay within their control. You became the variable they couldn't calculate, the emotional response they couldn't predict, the presence they couldn't neutralize. And what scared them wasn't just you, it was what you triggered inside them, because it wasn't a surface-level feeling anymore. It was something deeper being activated, something they don't easily manage. And people don't actually fear emotion itself, they fear what emotion does to their sense of control. That's why they pulled back. That's why their behavior became inconsistent. That's why their energy felt unstable. Not because the feeling was weak, but because it was too strong to handle directly. And when something feels too strong, it creates hesitation. Too much emotional weight forces decisions they weren't ready to make. But avoidance is never proof of absence, it's usually proof of impact. Inside them, two processes started happening at once. On the surface, their conscious mind tried to stay rational, distant, protected. But underneath that, something else kept pulling you back into awareness without permission. Not in a physical sense, but in thoughts, in pauses, in moments where distraction failed and their mind went quiet. And in those quiet moments, something shifted. You stopped feeling distant. You started feeling more defined, more present, harder to ignore. That's when denial begins to lose ground, because denial only works when emotional distance is still possible. But when something keeps returning internally, distance stops being effective. And what's even more unsettling is that the feeling didn't weaken with time, it sharpened. Once something moves from uncertainty into internal recognition, it doesn't stay passive. It starts demanding attention. That shift happened for them, quietly, but firmly. Not through drama, not through confrontation, but through understanding. And once something is understood at that level, it cannot simply be erased. They can ignore it for a while. They can distract themselves. But they can't unknow what they now know. And that creates chaos before it creates clarity. Because now they're forced to face everything they avoided, what this means, what it changes, and what it might require from them emotionally. Feelings like this don't stay neutral, they grow. They evolve, they push for expression even when the person tries to contain them. So now they're stuck between control and emotional pressure, between what they want to maintain and what they can no longer fully suppress. And the hardest part is this. This was never just about you. It was about what you brought to the surface in them. That internal shift didn't stop. It only became more structured. Because once a feeling gets named internally, it becomes harder to dismiss. Awareness doesn't reduce intensity. It organizes it. It turns vague emotion into something undeniable. And now everything carries weight. Thoughts feel heavier. Memories feel intentional. Silence feels charged. At some point, internal conflict begins. One part of them moves toward understanding what this is, while another part tries to retreat from it. Neither side fully wins. This isn't confusion, it's division. A psychological split between wanting and resisting at the same time. And the deeper the connection feels, the stronger both sides become. So they start analyzing instead of feeling. Overthinking replaces instinct. What once felt natural now feels risky because it's no longer emotionally light. And that creates a contradiction they can't easily resolve. The same thing drawing them in is also the thing making them pull away. That contradiction drains them mentally. It follows them into ordinary moments. Even neutral situations begin to carry traces of you in their thoughts. Not in obvious ways, but in subtle triggers. A tone, a pause, a feeling of silence that suddenly reminds them of something unspoken. And their mind keeps returning to you without permission. Not because they decided to, but because something inside them hasn't settled. This is what happens when emotional significance crosses a certain threshold. It stops needing permission from conscious thought. Now it operates underneath awareness, continuously influencing reactions, focus, and mood. And the more they try to suppress it, the more pressure builds internally. Because suppression doesn't end emotion, it only transforms it into tension. And tension doesn't disappear on its own. It accumulates until it forces resolution. Right now they are still resisting, still trying to manage it, still trying to slow something that is already developing on its own. But the truth is simple. The mind doesn't stay balanced under unresolved emotional pressure forever. At some point, something has to give, and they're closer to that point than they realize, not on the surface. Outwardly, they still look composed, controlled, almost unchanged. They know how to perform that version of themselves well, but that's only what you can see. Underneath that layer, where thoughts aren't curated, where there's no audience, no control, no image to maintain, something very different is happening, and they feel it. Not clearly, not comfortably, but in a way they can't dismiss anymore. Because repression always comes with a price, and that price is starting to show up now. The longer someone tries to push away something that is real inside them, the more forcefully it returns. Not in a soft or logical way, but in waves that interrupt everything they thought they were managing. And what once felt distant or controllable starts to feel immediate, even intrusive. This is where their sense of control starts to weaken, because what they once brushed off as unimportant is no longer staying in the background. It keeps reappearing, it keeps pressing in, and what they once convinced themselves they could ignore is now impossible to fully avoid. This is the point where it becomes unsettling. Because when the mind can no longer hold something down, it doesn't politely release it. It breaks containment. There is a well-known psychological idea behind this. What gets pushed into the subconscious doesn't disappear. It finds other ways to surface. And now it is no longer subtle. It's showing up in their reactions, their mood shifts, their irritability, their lack of focus, especially in moments when thoughts of you surface unexpectedly. And in those moments, it doesn't feel like a simple thought anymore. It feels like an interruption. Something that cuts through everything else without permission. Slowly, they are beginning to realize something they didn't want to face. You are no longer just someone outside their inner world. You've become part of it. And that changes everything. Because external things can be avoided. They can be ignored, delayed, replaced. But internal experiences don't stay in one place. They follow them everywhere, into silence, into distraction, into rest, into the moments where they assume they are alone with themselves. And this is where their resistance begins to weaken. The question is no longer whether they feel something. That part is already becoming obvious to them, even if they resisted it for a long time. The real question now is what they are going to do with it. And that is exactly what unsettles them. Because any response requires exposure, and exposure means vulnerability. And vulnerability means giving up control over how much they reveal, even to themselves. But the truth is, they've already been changed by this, not in a surface-level way, and not in something they can easily undo. Something in how they process emotion, how they interpret connection, how they experience absence. It has already shifted. Your absence is no longer just absence. It has weight now. It lingers. It stays active in their mind, even when nothing is happening. And that is what creates the tension. Because it's not just about missing you. It's about continuing to feel your presence in moments when you are not there at all. This produces a loop in their mind, a cycle that keeps returning to the same realization. Nothing else seems to carry the same emotional impact anymore. Other things feel flatter, less significant, less engaging in comparison. And whether they want to admit it or not, that comparison is starting to reshape how they see everything else. That leads to a quieter but more uncomfortable realization. What they feel here cannot easily be replaced or substituted. And once that thought settles in, it creates a new kind of fear. Because something irreplaceable makes loss feel real. And loss, when it becomes real, carries weight they can't ignore. This is where their behavior starts to shift without them fully understanding why. One moment they lean toward the feeling, the next they pull away from it. One moment they feel drawn in, the next they try to regain distance. It looks like inconsistency, but internally it's conflict. Part of them wants to move closer to resolve the tension, to understand it, to stop the internal noise. Another part of them is trying to protect their sense of control by stepping back from anything that feels too emotionally consuming. And both sides are active at the same time. That is what makes it exhausting, because neither side is fully winning, and neither side is fully letting go. And beneath all of this is something even deeper, identity. The version of them that feels this, and the version of them that tries to avoid it, are no longer aligned, and maintaining both at once is becoming harder. They are starting to notice their own patterns now, the avoidance, the deflection, the mental shifts they use when things get too close to emotional truth. And that awareness changes things. Because once someone becomes aware of their own avoidance, it stops working the same way. Even their coping mechanisms begin to feel obvious to them. Even their distance starts to feel intentional, in a way they can no longer fully justify. And that creates discomfort, because now even silence doesn't feel neutral anymore. Even avoidance feels like a choice they are aware of making. And that awareness removes the illusion that they are simply not affected. They are, and now they know it. At this stage, there is no return to ignorance. They can't go back to not noticing. They can't go back to not feeling the pull. Something has already changed in how their mind organizes this experience, and that shift keeps building pressure. Because the more they resist, the more obvious the internal contradiction becomes. They can feel something deeply, but still try to act like it doesn't matter. And that contradiction is not sustainable forever. Eventually, something has to give. Right now, they are still holding on to control as best as they can, still trying to manage it internally, still trying to slow down something that is already unfolding on its own. But the mind doesn't stay in contradiction indefinitely. It moves toward resolution one way or another. And when emotional pressure builds long enough without release, it begins to force clarity. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, until avoidance becomes harder than acknowledgement. And that is where they are heading. Because the cost of ignoring what they feel is slowly becoming heavier than the cost of facing it. And when that balance shifts, so does everything else. What once felt like something they could contain begins to feel like something that needs expression. What once felt manageable begins to feel unresolved. What once felt optional begins to feel unavoidable. They are getting closer to that threshold now, whether they fully realize it or not. And once that threshold is crossed, the internal shift doesn't stay internal for long. It moves outward. It expresses itself. It finds form. Not because they suddenly decide to, but because holding it in becomes harder than releasing it. At that point, clarity doesn't bring calm. It brings urgency. A sense that something needs to be addressed. Not later, but soon, and they are already feeling that pressure building. Because once something is fully recognized inside the mind, it doesn't remain passive. It starts shaping thought patterns, emotional responses, even attention itself. It becomes harder to ignore, harder to suppress, harder to pretend it isn't there. And what they once tried to minimize is no longer something they can reduce. It exists now in full awareness. And that awareness changes everything, because now every excuse feels thinner. Every attempt to rationalize feels weaker. Every effort to dismiss it feels less convincing, even to themselves. And this is where internal resistance starts to collapse. Not all at once, but gradually, as justification stops holding the same weight it once did. They are reaching a point where continuing to avoid this requires more effort than actually confronting it. And that imbalance is what leads to change. Because eventually, the mind chooses the path that creates less internal conflict, even if it is uncomfortable. And right now, the conflict is becoming impossible to ignore. So even if nothing has been said out loud, even if nothing has been acted on yet, something within them has already shifted toward resolution. Not fully expressed, not fully visible, but already decided at a deeper level. And that is the part that matters most. Because once something is decided internally, it doesn't stay contained forever. It moves. And when it does, it changes everything. What you're really describing is the psychology of unresolved emotional fixation combined with repression, and how the mind behaves when something breaks through its usual defense system. At the surface level, a person may still function normally. They talk, laugh, work, and maintain control. But underneath that performance layer, the brain is constantly processing emotional data that hasn't been resolved. When something or someone creates a strong emotional imprint, the mind doesn't simply store it and move on. It keeps reactivating it, especially in quiet moments when external distraction drops. This is where repression starts to fail. Repression is not deletion, it's more like containment. The mind pushes unwanted feelings out of conscious awareness, but they don't stop existing. They continue operating in the background, influencing mood, attention, and reactions in indirect ways. That's why someone can feel fine in one moment and suddenly irritated, distracted, or emotionally charged in the next, without a clear external reason. When the emotional charge is linked to a specific person, the brain starts building repeated associations. It connects thoughts, memories, sensations, and even random triggers back to that person. Over time, this creates what feels like involuntary return of thought. Not because the person is choosing it, but because the neural pathways have become reinforced. At that stage, suppression actually makes the experience stronger. The more something is pushed away, the more the brain flags it as important. Psychologically, anything repeatedly avoided is treated as significant data, so it gets revisited more often, not less. This is where internal conflict begins to form. One system in the mind tries to maintain identity, control, and emotional stability. Another system is processing emotional reality that doesn't fit that controlled self-image. So the person starts splitting internally between what they think they should feel and what is actually being experienced. That split is what creates inconsistency. It can look like mixed signals, withdrawal, overthinking, sudden emotional shifts, or avoidance behaviors. But underneath all of that is one core issue. Emotional processing is happening faster than conscious acceptance. And when awareness starts to form, something important happens. The mind begins to recognize its own avoidance patterns. It notices when it is deflecting, rationalizing, or distracting itself. That awareness is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of control. The person is no longer just feeling something, they are also aware that they are trying not to feel it fully. This is where emotional tension becomes self-reinforcing, because now it's not just about the feeling itself, it's about the fact that the feeling persists despite resistance. That creates a loop where the mind keeps checking, analyzing, and re-evaluating the emotion, which keeps it active. In psychology, this is closely tied to cognitive dissonance. The mind is holding two conflicting realities at once. I am unaffected, and this keeps affecting me. The longer both exist, the more psychological pressure builds, and pressure always demands resolution. Resolution doesn't always mean action, but it does mean a shift in internal alignment. Either the person integrates the feeling and accepts it, or they intensify avoidance, until emotional exhaustion forces a breakdown of resistance. What makes this even more powerful is attachment formation. When emotional significance combines with repeated mental return, the brain starts treating the source as emotionally relevant for regulation. That means thoughts of the person don't just feel like memories anymore, They start functioning like emotional triggers that alter mood and attention in real time. This is why absence can feel louder than presence. The brain begins filling gaps with internal representation. It simulates interaction, meaning, and emotional scenarios even without external input. So the person is no longer only reacting to reality, they are reacting to their own internal reconstruction of it. At that point, control becomes less about stopping feelings and more about managing their intensity. But management is unstable when the emotional source keeps reinforcing itself internally. So what eventually develops is a push-pull dynamic. Approach tendencies rise because the brain seeks resolution and relief from tension. Avoidance tendencies rise because the identity system fears loss of control or emotional vulnerability. Both systems activate simultaneously, which creates exhaustion, confusion, and inconsistency. And here's the key point most people miss. This doesn't require action from the outside to intensify. The entire process is internal. Even silence, even distance, even inaction becomes part of the loop because the mind continues processing meaning regardless of external input. Over time, if nothing resolves it, the emotional load doesn't fade on its own. It stabilizes at a higher intensity level, meaning the person stops getting over it and starts getting used to carrying it. But carrying it still creates pressure. Eventually, something gives, not always dramatically, but inevitably in some form of decision-making shift. Either the person moves toward acknowledgement, or they restructure their avoidance so heavily that it changes their behavior in noticeable ways. What you're really looking at is not just attraction or thought fixation. It's the brain trying to resolve an unresolved emotional imprint that has crossed into identity-level relevance. And when something reaches that level, it stops being optional in the mind. It becomes something that has to be processed one way or another, even if the person resists it for a long time. What they are going through was never just a passing thought or a temporary emotional reaction. It is something deeper, something that has already reshaped the way their mind responds, even if they are still trying to act unchanged on the outside. The truth is, once something reaches this level of emotional significance, it stops being something they can simply ignore or return from at will. The mind may resist, it may delay, it may distract itself for a while, but it cannot fully erase what has already taken root within it. And that is where they stand now, in that uncomfortable space between denial and awareness, where everything they once tried to avoid is slowly becoming impossible to unsee. Because the more they try to push it away, the more clearly it defines itself inside them. And the more clearly it defines itself, the less control they feel over how they respond to it. At some point, the internal conflict cannot stay unresolved. It either turns into acceptance or it turns into a breaking point where avoidance simply stops working. And when that moment arrives, it won't feel like confusion anymore. It will feel like clarity they can no longer escape, a realization that what they feel has already changed something fundamental within them. And once that truth is fully seen, everything that follows will no longer be about guessing or resisting. It will be about finally facing what has been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. If this resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe to Jungian Path for more deep dives into the hidden psychology of the mind. And if you're truly paying attention, comment the word awakened below, so I know you've understood what most people miss.